My presentation is going to be broken into three sections. The first section, we're going to share with you a little bit around what we're seeing out there in the market in terms of both trends and some of the good practices that are starting to emerge around private and public clouds. Second part of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about our strategy and our product set. And the third piece, we'll talk a little bit about customers and what the results have been that some customers have gotten. So there's been a lot of talk about cloud computing, but really the discussion shouldn't be limited to cloud computing. It's about the evolution of IT, the next generation IT, and there are three vectors that are really shaping that. The first one is economy. Obviously, we're recovering from the worst economy in recent memory, and during that period, IT was under a lot of pressure, understaffed, overworked. We have a labor issue worldwide, where as people start to virtualize and start to build new infrastructure, there's just not enough people to go around, not enough skill sets. You see companies left and right that have these job openings that they struggle to fill around skill sets. Training is not easy. And at the end of the day, manual, repetitive works is not exactly what everybody else signed up to do. Also, we're seeing a phenomenon where the line of business is getting very impatient, and they want results now. A lot of the IT organizations are backlogged in terms of being able to deliver on their projects. And we have this concept of rogue IT, where certain set of users or line of businesses may decide to go out there on their own, use a credit card, go to Amazon EC2 and provision some licenses. And this is very dangerous, obviously. I met with a CIO not too long ago where the way he found out about the fact that they were using public clouds was through their finance team, where they tracked a set of credit card transactions to a set of developers. They thought that these developers were buying books or music, and what they found was indeed that there was about 100 instances running on Amazon. And of course, there's, that's good if it follows IT process and it's sanctioned, but if it's not sanctioned, you have the risk of customer information, IP, other things that could go on there. But that's the mindset that many line of businesses want. They want IT departments to come in with much more of a variable cost, much more differentiated set of services. As another CIO told me, is he needs to deliver a FedEx experience. He needs to be able to give the business options. If the business wants something next day or next week, they should be able to have that option. It might cost more. It might not be as flexible as one-off configurations, but we're seeing a general trend around this. Obviously, there's a notion of chargeback and service accounting that goes along with this as well. On the technology side, which is the second vector, we're now seeing vendors, both hardware, software, and service providers, design services and infrastructure components with cloud computing in mind. Much more greener, much more denser. So there's innovation that's taking place all around us, which is fantastic, instead of leveraging existing equipment and existing models. This convergence idea is very big and obviously getting a lot of traction. Also, what we've seen on the process side is as ITIL and other frameworks are taking hold, they always had a theoretical construct around the service catalog and being able to define your services and cost them and have platinum versus silver versus bronze services. Well, that's coming into fruition because now you can make those service catalogs much more actionable. So this notion is not foreign. Obviously, it requires a certain degree of maturity, but we're seeing that out there. And also, we're seeing companies really embrace and extend how they can integrate, simplify, and automate their IT processes, whether it's physical, virtual, or cloud. As you look at the last 2 years, majority of organizations, either for cost savings or IT efficiency, have started to look at how to break down the silos and start integrating these. I want to borrow a quote from CIO at JP Morgan Chase, Guy Chiarello, where he basically told his organization that we need to move away with this a la carte thinking where every developer comes in and designs basically what the infrastructure is, to much more of a Happy Meal model where you have standardized, configured configurations that are ready for ordering. And you can price them, And if one of those configurations doesn't meet the needs of the business, guess what? We're no different than we are today. That's the exception. That becomes option 4, which is custom tailored. The majority of the workloads, however, if you do your planning correctly, can fit within the catalog, within the standards. And we're going to talk a little bit around the best practices around that. The third one's on the business. And again, as I said, business is impatient. They have alternative methods for delivery. But also what's important is many organizations are increasing their rate of change as they're adopting agile and other development processes. The bottleneck becomes IT operations, becomes the turnover process, becomes the release process. And that's really important. The second trend that we're seeing is many organizations are starting to adopt SaaS-based applications. I met a CIO who said 40% of my most mission-critical applications are now outside my 4 walls, such as Salesforce, WebEx, Workday, number of these applications that are mission-critical, important, the business depends on them, but they're run outside of the firewall. Now, many of you, I'm sure, use Salesforce. If a sales rep has a problem putting in an order, who do they call? Do they call Salesforce.com? No, they call your IT help desk. So these external services are becoming more and more part of the fabric of what IT delivers. And quite frankly, they're changing the role of IT because in some cases, IT moves from being the sole provider of services to more of the service broker and the integrator. Now, let's talk a little bit about virtualization. This is a slide that I've used consistently in the last 3 years to showcase kind of the maturity that we're seeing out there with customers. Much of the discussion when we began 5 years ago was around level 1, around CapEx savings through consolidation. I think most of us have those projects behind us. Can I get a show of hands in terms of how many of you are at level 2 where you're virtualizing 30 to 60% and have a virtual first policy? That's great. That's fantastic. I'm seeing that number go up more and more. Almost there's not a single company that I go across that hasn't put in the virtual first policy in place. Well, there's different management problems associated with each of these layers. And in level 2, really the big problem becomes virtual machine sprawl. Obviously, enterprise scale as you start rolling this out from a manageability standpoint becomes a big problem. Also managing the full stack. I think as you're moving more and more into business applications, the criticality from a performance, from a configuration, from a release standpoint of those applications that are hosted on the VMs become important. And also this notion of vMotion sickness was something we talked about last year, which is as vMotion and DRS do all their wonderful things around optimizing and providing mobility, it wreaks havoc on many of the IT processes. So change, config management, et cetera, and becomes a big compliance and governance issue. So how do you deal with that? How do you ensure that as these workloads are being mobile, you still have a single view of the infrastructure and can do all the management processes as you go through that? We're going to spend the majority of this presentation talking about level 3 because from a year ago where cloud computing was introduced en masse at this show to now, we've seen the broadest adoption. And cutting through the hype, we have over 180 customers today that are actively looking at cloud computing from a strategy development and dozens that are in production, whether it's private clouds or public clouds. So we're going to share with you some of what we're seeing out there. Obviously, from the key attribute standpoint, cloud starts with having a set of offerings that are well-defined and organized so that the end users can come in and request them. There's a great deal of automation that goes in. We'll talk about what that automation entails. And then there's things such as chargeback and showback that goes into utilization of those resources. Adopting external clouds has its own challenges around understanding who the trusted cloud provider is, what are the identity and access management challenges that you have, what are the performance management challenges you have, can that provider live up to the SLA, and quite frankly, lock-in, which we're going to talk a lot about. But what we're seeing is that a lot of this maturity This is an evolution, not a revolution. I think the theme of Paul Maritz's conference is, in fact, that, which we see many enterprise organizations take a pragmatic, evolutionary route to go virtualize, automate, and then look at cloud in terms of providing self-service front ends and kind of the shared resource pools. Because not every application lends itself to those type of usages. Quite frankly, many of us have applications that are already virtualized and provisioned. And in many cases, there might be just a single instance of them. So in some cases, the business case is not there to force cloud into every discussion. But the reason why we've gotten so much interest from the customers and why there is almost, I don't want to call it hysteria, but this mad rush is because of what some of the key players have done, like Amazon, to open people's eyes and show what's possible. And many IT organizations taking the lead from that and developing a set of data center principles that they can use within their shop. So some of the common attributes around the design principles is that the majority of these cloud offerings are highly virtualized, obviously. Second, they're highly automated. I promise you, Amazon's one of our clients. I promise you they don't have thousands of sysadmins sitting back there provisioning servers. And the third, they're service-oriented. It's about the service. Cloud is about the services that the cloud provides, not about the infrastructure or the hypervisor or the hardware. All of those things are extremely important, and they shouldn't go. But what the end users see at the end of the day is the services. And when we talk about the services, obviously there are the three main paradigms around infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. They each target a different user community and therefore have different expectations, different models. And quite frankly, when it comes to enterprise cloud computing, not all of them are applicable to every industry and every company. Now, by far and away, out of the 180 plus opportunities that we've seen, the biggest area of interest is around infrastructure as a service. And the reason for that is that it's the most primitive form that every service provider and enterprise needs to address. You can argue that if you don't have infrastructure as a service done correctly, it's very difficult to build on the others because your capacity and somewhere, somehow, you have to basically be able to provision infrastructure and manage it. Now, in our vocabulary and our vernacular, and we have to say this, I'm not going to have a slide that says this is our definition of cloud because, I hate those presentations because people are more focused on what is a cloud and is not a cloud versus the benefits. But for our taxonomy, when we talk about a public cloud, we mean an enterprise class public cloud. So Amazon VPC, some of the vCloud providers that are coming out, folks like Savis, Rackspace, et cetera. People who target largely enterprises and small to mid-size companies. A little bit of consumer as well, but less consumer. On the private cloud, what we mean is basically enterprise-owned and managed, run within your data center. And our definition for the hybrid cloud is being able to leverage external services in conjunction with your internal services, whether that's federating those services or whether that's actually provisioning external resources from the on-premise location. Now, why about cloud computing? This is the most important question. Now, what we found, originally when we talked about it a year ago, a lot of discussion was look at all the technology features and functionality that you can provide, how much better the world will be, how much cost savings you may have. To our surprise, actually, the number one reason why many of these customers are contemplating setting up private clouds is agility, the time to change, the time to respond. And that's very interesting because that's what the business cares about. And again, if you're a service provider, obviously you're thinking number one reason for you is revenue. But if you're an enterprise, it's how quickly can I fulfill demand. Number two is balancing IT control and responsiveness. And as somebody said, you can have a car that goes really fast that doesn't have a brake system. Nobody's going to drive in that car. So, speed is great as long as there's controls. So you want to have some IT controls. You don't want the auditors to come in and have a hard time with that. And then also it increases quality and the consistency of services. Gartner Group has for long talked about the more you reduce variables, the more you standardize, the more you're attacking TCO. And lastly, obviously, it resets the cost structure for IT, particularly in hybrid models, where you can actually assess your workloads and say which are the workloads that, for compliance, financial, other reasons, should always be permanently housed internally, and which are the workloads that are so transient, maybe they're not core to my business, that could be hosted outside, and I can get a variable pricing just for the time that I use it. And that's really critical. For example, one of our clients is a large software company, and they decided to put all their training courses for their customers on a public cloud. In fact, actually, they use two public clouds. One is Amazon, another one is a large telco-based cloud. And the reason was that they could flex that. If they had a lot of folks showing up for training 1 week, they can actually spin up those VMs very quickly. If nobody has a class for a week or two, they don't have to pay for those services. I think there's a lot of misnomers around cost. You have to balance the cost equation with the actual usage of that application. And probably the most important reason why people are looking at cloud is that it actually it's a catalyst to improve IT maturity. There are shortcuts that organizations can take by having a new cloud-based infrastructure to really accelerate their maturity around their IT processes and their management. Now, it's going to be a very crowded marketplace. We have visibility into what some of the other service providers are going to come out with in the next 6 months. And it's great from a consumer standpoint. You're going to have lots of choices on which service providers you want, what's the SLA that you want, choices around infrastructure, choices around storage and compute and hypervisors, lots of choice. Now, this is naturally a good thing. I wanted to caution you that one of my favorite books is by a guy by the name of Barry Schwartz. I don't know if you guys have read this book. It's The Paradox of Choice. There's a great TED Talk from 2004 that's on YouTube. I encourage you to look at that. The premise of his book is that logic suggests that having all options allows people to select precisely what makes them happiest. But as studies show, abundant choice often makes for misery. And the reason for this is that, quite frankly, everybody will market their capabilities to the fullest. And at the end, it's up to you, the consumer, to do your homework and do your due diligence to see what is the best fit. And I think this is one of the areas that, as we talk about the benefits and challenges, comes in. So on the benefit side, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about these. These are all well known. I want to talk about what are the 6 biggest challenges that we're seeing around cloud computing, particularly when it comes to public clouds. And the first one, and the 0th one, et cetera, is around security, privacy and compliance. This is really important. Obviously, if you're in a regulated industry, sometimes the risk-reward ratio is just not there. Even if the providers are secure, sometimes customers will say, if all I'm saving is 10-20%, it's just not compelling enough for me to take the risk. Second, it's not suitable for all applications. Many applications require connections back to your data center, which creates a latency and scalability issue. So there's no company that I've spoken to of any great size with any number of apps that's planning on shutting down and decommissioning their data center and using external services exclusively. It just doesn't work. Even the ones that are hosting private clouds recognize that certain applications don't lend themselves to the private cloud grid model. Also, the economics and the service levels vary quite a bit. And Amazon, as a leader, as the pioneer in this space, chose not to really provide any SLAs per customer. And many of the other service providers are actually leveraging that. They're going to include that in their offering and give you a lot of choices. But that still doesn't mean that you can actually measure and understand those service levels and understand that with expedited service levels, there's a cost associated with that. The fourth one is, again, this notion of rogue IT. You have to think about external clouds within the context of your normal IT processes, because otherwise the risk is too great for most organizations. The risk of an employee leaving or a business unit leaving, not people having no access, no visibility into what's out there, is too great. There's also cultural inertia. On one hand, it's positive in certain camps who love cloud. They want that experience of a 5-minute provisioning. On the other hand, you're going to have a challenge with some of your application owners who don't want to share. They don't want their infrastructure to be shared. And then the last thing, and one of the most important things around vendor lock-in, because what scares many of our customers is around lock-in, both between the cloud providers and some of the hardware vendors who are providing solutions that are end-to-end and full stack, but at that point you're feeling like you're making a multi-year decision and you're locked into that vendor. And particularly when it comes to management, that's one of the areas that management abstracts and provides a consistent view, or technically it should, across the various vendors. So let's talk a little bit around the best practices, some of the tips. Again, some of this comes from the work we've done in the field. The first one is you have to focus on the key business problem you're trying to solve. And I say this because for different organizations it's different. If you want to fix agility, you need to baseline where you're at and quantify it, understand what's a realistic target, understand what the business case is. If your focus is around standardization or cost saving first, you need to basically be able to build that business case in such a way that the cloud project pays for itself, as opposed to being just a pet project in the lab. The second piece is to baseline your current existing capability. This is what we've seen the most successful cloud projects do. They actually sit down and understand what the cost for their existing delivery model is. They exactly understand the timing of how long it takes from a business request to the time that service is up, so that they can measure that both as operational KPIs, so that they can do continuous improvement, but also as a feed into the business case, as I talked about. The third one is that you have to start with a reference architecture. This is really important, because organizations that just install the products and go at it without thinking about scale, security, what are the interfaces that you need, oftentimes have to be restarted. Even if you prove the POC to be successful, you have to start from scratch. It's much easier to start with an architecture in mind, implement it in phases as you go. The next one is planning, planning, planning. And this is critical, particularly for enterprises. In the case of the service providers, oftentimes they can start with the storefront and say, what offerings am I going to go sell? Most enterprises have existing applications and existing workloads and existing customers. So your planning step needs to start with, what are my applications? What are their configurations? How are they being used? How do I model them so that I understand from a capacity management what performance metrics I need to provide? It's really easy to set up a shop. It's much harder to understand what items should be in the store and quite frankly, what the consequences of that is from a performance standpoint. Also, you have to design your service catalog, offerings, prices, and costs. You have to get a handle on that. It's like being at a restaurant and trying to design the menu. Now, this is where many organizations fail, because what they do is, using the analogy of restaurants, they take the recipes and put them in the menu. And I guarantee you, if we went to a restaurant, opened the menu, and saw the recipes for every dish, I'm not sure if too many of us would order any dishes. So you have to separate, to give yourself some flexibility, what the end users see, what's in your catalog, from the actual steps, the ingredients you need to be able to build that offering. And it's important to do this at a high level. Many organizations struggle with this because they'll call everything they're doing a service. And it needs to be in business terms so that it can be tracked and so that the business user knows what they're requesting and what they're buying. The next step is automating. And what we've seen is this automation really spans beyond just VM provisioning. It's now around the business applications, the middleware, even the networking and storage resources that the application needs. The seventh step here is that if you're using an external cloud, and this is important, if you're using Amazon or Rackspace or Savvis or Terramark or Quest or AT&T or any of those services, you need to define a placement policy on when do I use those services. And because usually, again, that's in conjunction of a private cloud. that for a certain set of requests, if they meet a certain set of guidelines, whether it's a compliance guideline or resource guideline, that's how you can orchestrate and automate the provisioning into the cloud. Lastly, and this is something, again, we learned from many customers who jumped in with VM provisioning, is that they had a different problem. They had the image proliferation problem where they had lots of images for each little configuration. This is a lesson we learned in desktop management, quite frankly, about a decade ago. Most organizations had tens or dozens of desktop images for each hardware and each configuration. And what became prevalent in the desktop world is this concept of thin provisioning, where you can lay down the base operating system, base standard middleware, and then layer on top of that the applications with each of the individual configurations. What that does is it reduces the number of images you have to manage. It really helps you in the day 2, day 3, day 5 patch management, configuration management, because if you just use VMs to provision, what happens the minute there's an update? Also, how do you keep your library of VMs under control? And this dynamic layer-based provisioning really helps you with that. Also, many organizations are viewing this as an assembly line. So they want to think about instrumenting monitoring right up front, as opposed to worrying about servers after you've deployed. So make sure you get all the security management pieces thought through as a part of your process. It's almost, think of it like an assembly line, just like Dell or any of the computer manufacturers that you order off the shelf. There should be an option that allows them to layer in whatever management you need. Obviously, in pre-production lab environments, you may not have as much scrutiny as in production, but you have to think about that. Last but not least, some of your IT processes and some of the auditors don't go away, right? So you have to think about license management. Well, I've had one customer that set up a private cloud and found out that they were immediately in violation of their licenses. So they have to actually you have to think through both change, config, and release from a Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, all the regulatory compliance. And then to keep the license police safe, you have to think about license management. How do you assign licenses? How do you manage that, particularly for VMs that are used in lab environments that get rebuilt over and over again? And then the last tip is around this notion of cost transparency. Now, many customers use the term showback instead of chargeback because chargeback has a negative connotation. Showback means I'm going to go to each line of business, show them what they used, and be able to justify the infrastructure cost based on an allocation that I might have per BU or per line of business. Now, I'm going to switch to our strategy around this space. As I said, we spend a lot of time looking at the problem. And what we discovered is that really if you look at the problem, given each customer's maturity, you have to address the life cycle in a highly modular fashion so that you can understand where customers have needs, be able to address that pain point, but be able to ultimately integrate to a more comprehensive platform. So we provide an integrated solution today that manages business services across their entire life cycle, from planning and governance to the support and requests to the provisioning and the monitoring. But we do this in a highly modular, componentized way. Now, our strategy is simple. We allow service providers to build secure, scalable, enterprise-ready cloud offerings. We then provide enterprises with the ability to build and manage their own private clouds in conjunction and next to their virtual and physical resources. Third is the federation of the two, allowing you to bridge secure, scalable services from the outside with the private clouds that you have, within one code set, with one set of interfaces, with the openness to be able to deal with different hypervisors, different cloud APIs. As the standards are being developed in this space, we want to build the abstraction layer and maintain that compatibility. Last but not least, we believe that increasing number of management functions can themselves be delivered as a service. And that's one of the things that we're actively working on. We've launched 2 software as a service offerings this year. One is Remedy as a Service, our flagship ITSM franchise, available to you in a SaaS model. The second, we've developed a Service Desk Express product, a lighter version of that product, on the Force.com platform, and we market that with Salesforce today. So that's our strategy. Now, our vision is that in the future, as organizations manage these service life cycles across the environment, what's important is that policies and service levels derive what set of applications are delivered to whom and where they originate. So services will be delivered on demand based on different tiers of categorization, whether it's platinum, whether it's gold, etc. Secondly, the allocation of internal and external resources will be done by policy, so that you can establish that for a certain set of workloads, for a certain set of BUs, where there's no compliance issues, maybe I'm going to use an external provider. And for applications that meet this criteria, perhaps the placement is within a VMware cloud, or perhaps a Zen KVM cloud, or perhaps a Hyper-V cloud. Whatever the virtualization technology is that you need underneath. Third one is for us to support multi-sourcing across all of our products. In other words, decouple this notion of a service so that the service can be internally hosted, or it could be externally resold by IT. As an example, having Salesforce in your CMDB as a service definition that really points to the Salesforce's offerings. Being able to and allowing you to conduct your IT processes for these external SaaS-based applications, as well as and in conjunction with your internal applications. Last but not least, we see an opportunity where we can continuously monitor and optimize the environment so that we can map better the utilization based on the seasonality that oftentimes businesses have. So the vision here is, think about a defrag on your laptop. When you, all of you I'm sure are familiar with that program. What it does effectively is looks at how the disk space is being utilized and recommends a more optimized view. We believe that the defrag for the data center is needed. For organizations that are highly seasonal, this will free up a number of resources based on the time that you need, and be able to continuously monitor this and even automate some of the reflexing of the infrastructure. And again, as I said before, we offer unified management processes, unified set of technology across physical, virtual, and private clouds, as well as allowing you to consume these external processes. So our first step in that actually was a product and an offering that we shipped in May of this year. It's available at our booth. If you guys want to get a demo, you can stop by. I encourage you to do that. It helps you set up a private cloud or a public cloud. So we have a number of service providers that are leveraging this to build their public clouds. It starts with a highly customizable, very intuitive self-service front end where you can define a catalog of services, tie that to the orchestration for provisioning and deprovisioning. We also provide you with self-service capabilities to manage the VMs, so allow developers, for example, to manage the VMs themselves. It's very appropriate for pre-production environments, probably not as appropriate for production environments in many organizations. And all of this is pre-integrated with the rest of your enterprise management around CMDB, change management, and compliance. And we do provide adapters, by the way, to some of our competitors' products or other third parties that you may have. But obviously, if you have BMC products, then this is just architected in, snaps in, and allows you to very quickly get value. One of the innovations we did is also it auto-instruments all the performance metrics. So as you're provisioning, you would define, and all the infrastructure monitoring, application monitoring is actually instrumented as a part of the lifecycle. And also, one of the innovations we made with our partner Cisco was around network containers. And this is a big problem for many organizations that have regulatory restrictions, where they need to show physical separation of different business units, resources. So if you have investment banking and retail banking, perhaps you want to carve up your infrastructure and guarantee that each of those divisions can leverage a virtual data center that cannot be connected. So a lot of that capability is built into the product, where you can safely and securely partition the infrastructure with this concept of network containers that we've developed with Cisco. And last but not least, it provides you a unified view into public services as well, whether that's Amazon VPC or any others. We also are announcing at the show our full support for the vCloud APIs, and we will continue to provide heterogeneous support for folks who are using VMware, Xen, other platforms in providing their services. The second offering that was launched, and again, it's integrated with the previous one, but it's available as a separate module, is a product that really addresses cost management and service costing. It can be a great product for you to plan your cloud offerings and cloud strategy, because it allows you to take a baseline of your existing costs and existing services. But it also acts very much centrally to organizations that are moving to that shared service model and want to provide a bill of IT to each of the different departments. We have embedded a number of best practices and about 8,000 different companies' data, anonymously, of course, so that you can benchmark yourself against your peers in various different industries and various sizes. And more importantly, as you start setting up a private cloud or a public cloud, you can actually measure cost and price, because those two concepts are very different. Do this both in terms of budgeted and actuals, and be able to do some of the decision support you may need on a quarterly or annual basis. And again, one of the great things about this is this leverages the same CMDB and service model, so that once you define services, those services are uniform across the offerings. From an architecture standpoint, I talked earlier about the architecture. If you were to look at, and this is where I'm going to use this handy laser pointer, come down. It all starts with a end user or a customer coming to a portal. This could be your portal, or it could be a branded version of ours. They can, just like a shopping cart experience, select an offering. You can associate pricing and configurations with that offering. Then what we've done is pre-integrated the orchestration and provisioning, so that once we take the order, it's almost like in a restaurant going to the kitchen, and based on what you ordered, provision that, build it, whether that's on-premise or off-premise. We have a number of out-of-the-box workflows to be able to do that end-to-end provisioning, be able to integrate it with your compliance management, instrument the performance management, and do the right things around financial tracking. And from that point on, our standard operation tools, like BMC Proactive Net Performance Management, can actually monitor the health and availability of these systems. Single console, whether it's physical, virtual, or cloud, it doesn't care. Obviously, it understands the nuances of a cloud or resource pools and virtualization, but single pane of glass from an operation standpoint. It's a huge advantage. Same thing around software distribution, patch management, all the config automation capabilities. At that point, there's no difference between whether that VM was provisioned through Virtual Center or whether it came in through a cloud. What we've also done, obviously, is the chargeback, so that we can give you a bill of IT, visibility into who requested what, perhaps what are the next generation set of services based on demand that you need. Now, all of this is centered around a set of metrics. I talked about this before. These are some of the customer data that we got from a large global IT company that we partnered with. We came in beforehand, did a process audit to find out how long it takes for them to provision services. What we found was pretty interesting. Actually, these numbers are pretty good, much better than many of the other enterprises that we've seen. It took them 14 days from the minute a customer said they wanted a physical server to the time it was provisioned. On the virtual side, it took them 6 days. Now, if you're wondering why does it take 6 days to get a VM provision, it's because it's not about the VM. It's about the storage, the networking, the security guy, all the different people that have to go touch it. By the way, in most enterprises, based on our process audits, we're seeing the provisioning time somewhere to the tune of 60 to 120 days. You'd be amazed, the bigger the organization is, the longer it takes, because it's very complex, and clearly this is a process, oftentimes where we're having this discussion with the customer, they haven't even documented it. So when they look at the 120 steps that it takes to actually provision a server, that's when we know we have some savings that we can show together in the business case. Now, what's also interesting is around deprovisioning. And particularly in cloud, this is something you have to think a lot about, because most of us in IT don't think about deprovisioning as much as we think about provisioning. But if you want to free up resources, you want to get good at both. And lastly, it's around scale up, scale down, scaling both vertically and horizontally. So in this case, we took SAP, showed how we can modify the VMware vSphere 4 settings to hot add memory and RAM in terms of horizontal scaling. Vertical scaling. In case of horizontal scaling, what it takes to add another app server to the mix. So, as I said, some of the benefits are agility, complete visibility and control, consistency across all the different environments, having this concept of continuous compliance built in, and achieving CapEx while meeting performance SLAs. The one key message I hope that you take from my presentation is pick your partner carefully. This is one of my favorite cartoons from Far Side. If you haven't seen it, it's a couple of pilots going in, and the quote says, "Say, what's a mountain goat doing way up here in the cloud bank?" And with that, I'm going to turn over to the questions. If you have questions, there's a mic up here, and I'll take questions until our time is up, and then I'm available for a few minutes afterwards if you like as well. Thank you very much for attending my talk.